Hey guys, welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Today's video is different. I'm going to tell you 9 real stories that happened in October, deep in the mountains. And I promise you, after hearing these, you won't want to go hiking alone ever again. These aren't fake stories. These are real people who went into the woods to relax and clear their minds. But they found something scary waiting for them, something they can never forget. But before we start, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Share it with your friends who love scary stuff. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I really want to know. Okay, let's begin. Here's the first story. I was 21 and working at one of those soul-crushing call centers where you spend 8 hours getting yelled at by people whose internet went down for 5 minutes. The pay was decent for someone without a college degree, but honestly, I was starting to lose my mind dealing with angry customers all day. My supervisor Jake could see I was burning out, so he recommended this hiking trail in Kentucky called Whispering Hollow. He said it was perfect for clearing your head. 10 miles of easy walking through a peaceful valley with good cell reception, which was important since I was still on call for emergencies. October 18th was my first real day off in 2 weeks, and I desperately needed some quiet time away from phones and complaints. I'd been hiking for about a year by then and felt comfortable doing moderate trails alone. The drive down to Kentucky took about 3 hours from my apartment in Cincinnati, and I was looking forward to just being in nature for a while. The parking area only had one other car when I got there around 9 a.m., but the trail was wide enough that I probably wouldn't run into the other hiker. That was fine by me. I wanted solitude. I grabbed my day pack with water and snacks, locked up my Honda, and headed into the woods. The first few miles were exactly what I needed. Quiet forest, gentle trail winding through the valley, beautiful fall weather with the leaves just starting to turn. I felt my work stress melting away as I walked deeper into the peaceful mountain valley. The trail followed a creek for most of the way, and around mile 4, I stopped for a snack break beside a spot where the water was crystal clear. You could see all the way to the bottom, maybe 3 feet down, with smooth rocks and little fish darting around. I sat on a fallen log, pulled out a granola bar, and just listened to the water bubbling over the rocks. For the first time in weeks, my mind wasn't racing with work problems or customer complaints. That's when I heard someone calling my name from across the valley. It was clear and distant, but definitely my name. The voice sounded like my coworker Sarah, which was weird because she was supposed to be working today and didn't even know where I'd gone hiking. I called back, thinking maybe she'd surprise me with a trip of her own, but got no response. Just the sound of the creek and birds in the trees. Then the voice called my name again, but from a different direction this time, deeper in the forest, away from the trail. I stood up and walked toward the sound, but found nothing there. Just empty forest, with no signs of other hikers, no footprints in the soft dirt, nothing. The voice came a third time, definitely Sarah's voice. But now it was calling from behind me, back toward the creek. I turned around and saw no one, but I could hear footsteps moving through the dry leaves. When I stopped to listen, the footsteps stopped too. Then my name echoed through the valley again, but this time it was my mother's voice calling me for dinner. The exact tone she'd used when I was a kid, that slightly impatient but loving way she'd call from the kitchen when I was playing outside. I knew my mom was at work 200 miles away in Ohio, so this was impossible, but the voice was perfect. Every inflection, every little accent quirk, it was definitely her. More voices started calling my name. My dad's deep voice from somewhere up the hillside, my brother's voice from across the creek. Friends from high school I hadn't talked to in years. All of them saying my name, over and over, from different directions. The voices were absolutely perfect replications. Not just similar, exact. The tone, the accent, the speech patterns of people I knew. They began having conversations with each other, using my family's voices to discuss things about me. I heard my mother telling my father about my job performance, in their exact voices and the way they actually talked to each other at home. The conversations included private information that no one else could possibly know. My brother's voice started telling embarrassing childhood stories that only he and I remembered, like the time I broke Mom's favorite vase and blamed it on the cat. Stories I'd never told anyone else, not even girlfriends. The voices were coming from all around me now, like I was surrounded by invisible family members having a reunion. They began calling me to come join them, using the exact phrases my family would use. "Come on, honey, dinner's getting cold," in my mom's voice. "Quit being stubborn and get over here," in my dad's voice. I tried to follow the voices to find their source, but they always stayed just out of sight. The conversations became more insistent, with family voices expressing worry about why I wasn't answering them. My mom's voice sounded hurt that I was ignoring her. My dad's voice was getting annoyed that I wasn't listening. Then I realized the voices knew things about me that even my family didn't know. Private thoughts, secrets I'd never shared with anyone, my own inner monologue about work, about girls I liked, about fears I'd never spoken out loud. That's when I understood these weren't recordings or my imagination. Something was actively studying and copying voices, learning the speech patterns of everyone important to me by somehow accessing my memories. The entities were using the voices to give me commands disguised as loving family requests. My mother's voice asked me to come deeper into the forest because she was lost and needed help. My father's voice scolded me for not listening to family and demanded I obey immediately. The voices became more desperate and angry when I didn't follow their instructions. I saw movement in the trees then, pale shapes that flickered between being visible and invisible, like heat shimmer but wrong. The creatures were tall and thin, with mouths that opened too wide when they dreamed and held chi. Spoke in stolen voices. They had no faces except for the impossibly large mouths that formed the perfect words and tones I knew so well. I realized they were hunters that used voice mimicry to lure prey, collecting voices from victims' memories like some kind of twisted recording device. They'd probably been doing this for decades, building a library of human speech to use as hunting tools. The echo hunters surrounded me, all speaking in different family voices and giving conflicting directions. My mother told me to come north. My father told me to go south. My brother laughed and said it didn't matter which way I went. They were trying to confuse and disorient me using emotional manipulation through familiar voices. Then, my own voice joined the chorus, somehow stolen and turned against me, telling me to give up and join them. Hearing my own voice say things I'd never said was the most disturbing thing yet. The creatures began arguing with each other using my family's voices, creating chaos and emotional distress that felt like being in the middle of a family fight where everyone was angry at me. I understood they fed on the emotional energy created by hearing loved ones' voices in dangerous situations. They had been collecting voices for decades, maybe centuries, waiting in this valley for lost hikers to torment. The only way to escape was to ignore all voices completely, even if they sounded like people I loved calling for help. I covered my ears and ran through the forest, crashing through underbrush and ignoring increasingly desperate pleas from every voice I'd ever cared about. My mother begged me not to leave her lost in the woods. My father demanded I stop being disrespectful. Friends promised they'd found the way out if I'd just come to them. The echo hunters followed, cycling through every person who'd ever said my name, trying to find the voice I couldn't resist. They used my grandmother's voice, dead for 5 years, calling me her special boy like she used to. They used my first girlfriend's voice saying she still loved me. They even used my own voice as a child, crying for help. I reached the main trail and found other hikers, a real couple with actual shadows and solid footsteps. The voices stopped immediately. I looked back into the forest and saw nothing but trees. I've never gone back to that trail, and for months afterward, I couldn't trust phone calls from family. I always had to video chat to make sure it was really them speaking. To this day, when someone calls my name from another room, I have to see them before I answer. Looking back now, I think those things are still out there, collecting voices and waiting for the next hiker to wander too far from the marked trail. Sometimes I wonder whose voice they'll use next. I was 26 when I started combining my house painting work with landscape photography, always looking for those perfect mountain shots that might actually sell someday. I'd been doing this for about 2 years by then, hiking with my camera gear whenever I had a weekend free. The work paid decent enough, but I figured if I could get some portfolio-quality nature shots, maybe I could eventually transition into something that didn't leave me covered in primer dust every night. I'd found this photography forum online where people shared locations for the best scenic shots, and someone had posted about Serpent's Ridge Trail in West Virginia. The way they described it, 14 miles of ridge walking with panoramic views, sounded exactly like what I was looking for. October 25th was forecast to have perfect visibility, and the fall colors were supposed to be at their peak. I figured it was worth the drive from Ohio to check it out. The trail was supposed to be challenging but rewarding, and honestly, that's exactly what I wanted. I'd been hiking solo for photography purposes long enough that I felt confident handling both activities at the same time. Plus, according to the forum post, most people didn't bother with the full ridge walk, so I'd probably have the scenic overlooks to myself for uninterrupted shooting. I left my apartment around 4 a.m. to get there by sunrise. The parking area was completely empty when I arrived, which was perfect. No other hikers meant I could take my time setting up shots without feeling rushed or getting people accidentally in my frames. I started hiking right at 6 a.m. to catch that early morning light hitting the distant ridges. The first 7 miles were everything I'd hoped for. Clear trail markers, incredible views every half mile or so, and the lighting conditions were absolutely ideal for photography. I was getting shots that looked like they belonged in National Geographic, not just some amateur's weekend hobby collection. The weather was crisp but not cold. Visibility was unlimited, and I remember thinking this might end up being my best photography hike yet. Around mile 7, I reached what the trail map called the main overlook area. The trail split here into several different scenic viewpoints, each one supposed to offer a different perspective on the valley below. I decided to hit the first overlook since the morning light was still perfect, then work my way around to the others before the sun got too high. That's when I found the amphitheater. At first I thought it was just another scenic overlook, but as I got closer, I realized I was looking at something that definitely wasn't natural. The rock formations were too organized, too deliberate. It looked like someone had carved a perfect semicircle into the mountainside, creating this natural-looking amphitheater that faced out over the valley. The stone surfaces were smooth, almost polished, and when I looked closer, I could see what looked like tool marks. Not recent ones. These were old, worn down by decades or maybe centuries of weather. But they were definitely there, showing that this place had been deliberately shaped by human hands. In the center of the amphitheater was a circular depression, maybe 15 feet across, filled with the darkest, richest soil I'd ever seen. It was almost black, with this oily consistency that made it reflect light in a weird way. The soil looked completely different from the thin, rocky mountain dirt everywhere else on the trail. Growing in that dark soil were plants I'd never seen before. They had these translucent leaves that looked almost see-through, and even though there wasn't any wind, they were moving slightly. Just a gentle, swaying motion, like they were breathing or something. I started taking photos of everything, thinking maybe this was some kind of rare geological formation or unique ecosystem. But when I pointed my camera at the center depression, something weird happened. The images kept coming out distorted and dark, even though my settings were perfect and the lighting was fine everywhere else. The air around the amphitheater felt thick too, hard to breathe, with this sweet smell like overripe fruit. It reminded me of walking into a greenhouse, except the smell was wrong somehow. Too sweet, too heavy. Walking around the edge of the amphitheater, I found carved symbols in the stone, spirals and geometric patterns, worn smooth by age. These carvings looked incredibly old, older than anything I'd ever seen in this part of the country, definitely predating any Native American settlements I knew about. Then I noticed the channels, carved grooves in the stone that led from the outer ring toward that central depression, like some kind of irrigation system. The channels showed staining along their edges, dark discoloration that suggested they'd been used to direct liquid flow many times over the years. That's when it hit me that this wasn't a natural formation at all. This was some kind of ancient feeding system, designed for a very specific purpose. The dark soil in the center was too fertile, too rich, compared to the thin mountain soil everywhere else. Something had been fed here, and whatever it was had changed the very composition of the earth in this spot. The plants growing in that enriched soil weren't native species. They'd evolved specifically for this environment, adapted to whatever nutrients were in that black earth. And looking closer at the soil itself, I started seeing bone fragments mixed in. Small pieces, but they definitely weren't animal bones. They looked disturbingly human. This place felt like an ancient sacrifice site, a feeding ground designed to nourish something that lived deep in the mountain. That's when the plants started moving more actively. Those translucent leaves began reaching toward me, with what looked like vine-like appendages. The dark soil started to bubbling, moving, like something underneath was responding to my presence. From deep within the mountain, I heard this low humming sound, like massive machinery starting up. The carved channels began filling with dark liquid that seemed to seep up from the stone itself. Whatever this place was built to feed was still active, still hungry after all these centuries. The plants released something into the air, spores or pollen that made me dizzy when I breathed them. The humming from below got louder and more complex, like something vast and ancient was waking up, something that had been waiting patiently for a very long time. Tentacle-like roots emerged from the black soil, reaching toward me with obvious intelligence. They moved with purpose, not like normal plant growth. The mountain itself was alive, and this amphitheater was its mouth. The entire depression began functioning like a digestive system. The plants, the soil, the channels working, everything working together in perfect coordination. Roots wrapped around my ankles, trying to drag me toward the center where that dark liquid was rising. I realized that hikers who disappeared in these mountains probably ended up here, feeding this ancient system. The civilization that built this place had either been consumed by their own creation, or they deliberately fed it for thousands of years. This wasn't just some creature living in the mountain. The mountain itself had become a living, hungry entity. My presence had triggered its feeding response, awakening an appetite that hadn't been satisfied in decades. The mountain's hunger was patient but absolute. Now that it was awake, it would need to feed regularly. I cut myself free from the roots using my pocket knife and ran. Behind me, the entire ridge started moving and shifting, like the mountain was trying to prevent my escape by changing the trail configuration. Trees that had been landmarks suddenly weren't where they should be. The path back seemed longer, steeper, wrong. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. As I drove away, I could feel the mountain settling back into dormancy behind me, but I knew something fundamental had changed. When I got home, I looked up satellite images of the area. The amphitheater had expanded in size since my visit, and over the next few months, I started seeing missing person reports. 3 other hikers have disappeared in that area since my visit. I don't do landscape photography anymore. I still paint houses, but I stick to residential neighborhoods now. Sometimes I think about those portfolio quality shots I was getting that morning, how they could have changed my whole career path. But honestly, some things aren't worth the risk. I've never told anyone about what I found up there. Until now, I guess. But if you're planning to hike in West Virginia, maybe stick to the well-traveled trails. Some places in these mountains are hungry, and they've been waiting a very long time for their next meal. I was 25 and working as a delivery driver for FedEx when I started getting serious about hiking. Honestly, I needed something to keep me in shape since I was sitting in a truck for 10 hours a day, and the gym felt like a waste of money I didn't have. North Carolina's got some beautiful trails, and I'd been working my way up from the easy stuff all summer. By October, I was feeling pretty confident about tackling longer hikes on my own. October 15th was one of those perfect fall days where the air's crisp but the sun's still warm, and I'd been looking forward to hitting Widow's Ridge Trail all week. It's supposed to be about 12 miles of moderate hiking through some pretty remote mountain wilderness. I'd done my research online, read the reviews, downloaded the trail map to my phone. Everything looked straightforward enough for someone who'd been building up to longer distances. The parking area was completely empty when I got there around 7 in the morning, which was exactly what I was hoping for. I love that peaceful feeling you get when it's just you and the mountains, no crowds or noise from other hikers. I checked my gear one more time. Plenty of water, some snacks, first aid kit, fully charged phone with the GPS app ready to go. I was planning to be back well before dark with time to spare. The first few miles were absolutely perfect. The trail was well marked with those blue blazes painted on trees every 50 yards or so, and the fall colors were incredible. Reds and oranges and yellows everywhere you looked, and that crisp mountain air that makes you feel like you could hike forever. I was making good time and feeling strong, thinking this might end up being my favorite hike yet. Around mile 4, I started noticing how quiet the forest was getting. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sometimes birds just aren't as active, or the wind dies down. But as I kept walking, it became really obvious that something was different. No birds singing, no insects buzzing. Even the wind through the trees had basically stopped. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the whole mountain. That's when I found the first stone cairn around mile 5. Someone had stacked rocks into a neat little pile about 3 feet high, with a piece of bark balanced on top. The bark had scratches carved into it that looked almost like letters, but not quite right. Like someone was learning how to write and couldn't get the shapes exactly correct. I was annoyed, honestly. This was supposed to be wilderness, not some place for people to leave their trail art projects. I knocked it over and kept walking, but a quarter-mile later I found 3 more cairns arranged in a perfect triangle pattern. Each one had that same type of marked bark, and the scratches were getting more deliberate and organized looking. I started taking photos with my phone, thinking maybe this was some kind of geocaching thing or art project I didn't know about. But it was weird how fresh everything looked, like someone had been out here recently setting this stuff up. The forest was completely silent now. I mean dead silent in a way that made my ears ring. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind. Just my footsteps and my breathing. That's when I noticed the red cloth strips tied to branches at eye level. Bright red fabric that looked brand new, not faded by weather or anything. They were tied about every 20 yards, forming a clear line leading off the main trail toward deeper wilderness. I followed them out of curiosity, thinking they might lead to some scenic overlook or hidden waterfall that wasn't on the official trail map. Maybe some local secret spot that regular hikers had marked out. Looking back now, I should have turned around right then and headed back to my truck. But I was curious, and I felt like I could handle whatever I might find out there. The red cloth strips led to a clearing where I found dozens of stone cairns arranged in concentric circles. In the center was a much larger cairn, maybe 5 feet tall, with what looked like personal items balanced on top. I could see a driver's license, some jewelry, and a cell phone, all belonging to different people, judging by what I could make out. The items looked like they'd been carefully arranged, almost like offerings or trophies someone was displaying. Around the edges of the clearing, I found handprints pressed into the soft earth. But they were wrong. Only 4 fingers each, and the proportions were too long for human hands. The fingers stretched out further than they should, and the palms were narrow and elongated. They were arranged in pairs leading into the forest, like something had been crawling on all 4s. That's when I heard the humming, a low, droning sound coming from the trees around the clearing. It was almost like someone trying to imitate singing, but getting the melody completely wrong. The humming stopped abruptly when I turned toward it, like whatever was making the sound knew I was listening and didn't want to be caught. I found more symbols carved into the trees around the clearing, stick figures and spirals that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Fresh cuts in the bark that definitely hadn't been there long. Someone or something had been marking this territory recently. I saw it for the first time standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall, pale, and perfectly motionless. It was shaped like a person but wrong in every possible way. Arms too long, head tilted at an angle that would break a normal person's neck. The thing's skin was gray-white like old bone, and it never seemed to blink or breathe. When I looked directly at it, the creature disappeared, but I could feel it watching me from somewhere else in the trees. I tried to leave the clearing, but found more red cloth strips blocking every path except one. The strips were guiding me deeper into the Appalachian forest, away from the main trail and any chance of running into other hikers. Every time I tried to go a different direction, I'd find fresh cairns or those horrible handprints forcing me back onto the path the thing wanted me to take. The creature appeared again, closer this time, crouched beside a tree like it was studying me. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like it was learning how bodies were supposed to work but couldn't quite get the mechanics right. Its arms bent in directions that hurt to look at, and its head kept tilting back and forth like a bird examining something interesting. I realized it had been watching me for hours, learning my behavior and herding me like livestock. Every time I thought I was making my own choices about which way to go, I was actually following a path it had laid out for me. The cairns, the handprints, the red cloth strips, they were all there to guide me exactly where it wanted me to go. The thing began making sounds, clicking noises and attempts at human speech that came out completely wrong. It was trying to copy my voice, repeating words I'd said earlier, but in a flat, emotionless tone that made my skin crawl. "Perfect day," it said in my voice. "Good time. Favorite hike yet?" But the words had no feeling behind them, like a recording playing back. More symbols appeared carved into trees around me, fresh cuts that hadn't been there minutes before. The creature was marking its territory with me inside it, claiming me as part of its domain. I understood that this thing was ancient, connected to these mountains in a way that went back long before humans had ever set foot here. It wasn't trying to hurt me immediately. It was studying me, learning what I was and how I functioned. The territorial display was both a warning and a claim. I belonged to it now, whether I understood that or not. I ran, crashed through the underbrush, ignoring all trails, branches tearing at my clothes and face. I could hear it following at a distance, that wrong humming sound and the clicking noises it made. Every time I thought I'd lost it, I'd see fresh symbols carved into nearby trees or catch a glimpse of pale skin between the branches. My phone had no signal and the GPS was showing impossible locations. According to the screen, I was sometimes 20 miles from where I should be, sometimes in the middle of a lake. The compass spun wildly and wouldn't hold a direction. But I kept running toward what I hoped was the main road. I finally reached pavement and flagged down a passing car. The driver was an older local guy who took one look at me and drove me straight back to the trailhead where my truck was waiting. I brought park rangers back the next day to show them the clearing and the cairns, but everything was gone. The symbols carved into trees, the red cloth strips, the arranged stone piles, all of it had vanished like it was never there. Only the handprints remained, pressed into the soft earth around where the clearing had been. 4-fingered prints that were too long and too narrow to be human. I still see red cloth strips sometimes, tied to trees in my peripheral vision when I'm driving mountain roads. They're never there when I look directly, but I catch glimpses of that bright red fabric that always looks brand new. I don't hike alone anymore, and I definitely don't follow unmarked trails or cloth strips, no matter how curious I get about where they might lead. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me from the mountains. Still learning, still waiting for me to come back to its territory where I belong. Back when I was 23, I thought I knew what scary looked like. I was working as a pharmacy technician in Richmond, counting pills and dealing with insurance claims all day. It wasn't exactly thrilling work, but it paid the bills while I trained for my first marathon. The running was the only thing keeping me sane. Those long weekend trail runs where I could forget about everything and just focus on putting one foot in front of the other. I'd been building up my mileage for months, and by October, I was ready for my longest training run yet. 16 miles through some serious mountain terrain. My buddy Jake had told me about this trail called Devil's Backbone Ridge out in Virginia, about 2 hours west of the city. He said it was perfect for ultra-distance training. Sustained climbs, technical terrain, the kind of remote wilderness that would really test my fitness. The plan was simple. Start at dawn, run for 3 to 4 hours through the mountains, and be back home by lunch. I packed my hydration pack with enough water and energy gels to keep me going, checked the weather forecast one more time, and headed out. October 22nd was supposed to be perfect, cool and clear, with the fall colors just hitting peak. The drive out was beautiful. Those Appalachian mountains in autumn are something else. Reds and oranges and yellows so bright they almost hurt to look at. I parked at the trailhead just as the sun was coming up, stretched for a few minutes, and started running. The first 8 miles were exactly what I'd hoped for. Good pace, steady energy, and scenery that made me forget I was supposed to be suffering. I was making excellent time, feeling confident about my marathon preparation. The trail wound through dense forest, over rocky outcrops, past little streams that caught the morning light just right. This was why I ran, moments like these, where everything felt perfect and possible. That's when I started noticing the white objects scattered through the trees. At first I thought they were rocks or maybe some kind of fungus. They were bright white against the dark forest floor, arranged in little clusters here and there. But as I got closer to one of them, I realized what I was looking at. Bones. Animal bones that had been cleaned completely and arranged in careful patterns around the base of a large oak tree. Small bones, ribs and leg bones from something maybe the size of a raccoon, formed a perfect spiral that went around the tree trunk 3 times. Each bone was placed exactly the same distance from the next one. The spacing was so precise, it looked like someone had used a ruler. And the bones themselves were wrong. Too clean, too white. Like they'd been bleached or treated with chemicals. I stopped running and took out my phone to snap a picture. This had to be some kind of art installation, right? Maybe a research project from one of the local colleges. But as I looked around, I realized this wasn't the only arrangement. There were more white spots visible through the trees ahead of me. Every few hundred yards, I found another display. Some were simple, just a few bones laid out in straight lines or geometric shapes. Others were more elaborate. Larger bones from deer or maybe wild boar arranged in complex patterns on the ground. And always that same surgical precision, that same unnatural whiteness. The weirdest part was how fresh everything looked. No weathering, no moss growth, no signs that these arrangements had been sitting out in the forest for any length of time. But they were deep in the woods, miles from any road or trail access. Who would come all the way out here to arrange animal bones? And where were all the animals? I'd been running for over an hour now and hadn't heard a single bird call or seen any sign of wildlife. The forest was completely silent except for my footsteps and breathing. I kept running, but slower now, stopping to photograph each new arrangement I found. Some of them included what looked like finger bones, human finger bones, arranged in star shapes around central skulls. The precision was getting more elaborate, more complex. Like whoever was doing this was getting better at it, perfecting their technique. That's when I found the fresh kill sites. The first one was a deer that had been butchered with surgical precision. The carcass was still warm, blood still bright red on the leaves around it. But all the bones had been removed. Every single one. The cuts were too clean for any predator I knew about. They looked like they'd been made with proper tools, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Blood trails led away from the kill site toward where I'd found some of the bone arrangements. A clear collection and transportation system. I started following one of the trails, my marathon training completely forgotten now. This was active. Recent, whatever was doing this was working right now, while I was here. I found another deer about a quarter mile away. This one was still alive. It was lying on its side, breathing but not moving, and it had been completely skeletonized while its organs remained intact. Someone or something had removed every bone from its body without damaging the surrounding tissue. The deer's eyes were still bright, still aware, but its body was just a mass of organs and skin with no structure to support it. The precision was impossible. You can't remove bones from a living animal without killing it. You can't strip flesh that cleanly without proper surgical equipment. And you definitely can't do it out here in the middle of the woods. I heard clicking sounds coming from ahead on the trail. Not like branches snapping or rocks falling. Deliberate clicking, rhythmic, like someone tapping bones together. Like communication. I crept forward through the trees until I could see what was making the noise. 3 figures were hunched over. Another deer carcass about 50 yards away. They were pale, almost white, and they moved with impossible speed and coordination. Their hands worked over the animal, stripping flesh from bones faster than I could follow with my eyes. But I couldn't see any tools, just their hands, which seemed wrong somehow. Too many joints, fingers that bent in directions that shouldn't be possible. They worked in perfect coordination, like parts of a single organism rather than 3 separate individuals. No wasted motion, no hesitation. They knew exactly what they were doing. When one of them finished cleaning a femur, another would immediately take it and add it to a growing arrangement nearby. The third would start working on the next section of the carcass. The clicking sounds were how they communicated, tapping messages to each other with the cleaned bones. That's when they noticed me watching. All 3 stopped working at exactly the same moment and turned to stare at me. Their faces were blank. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth skin stretched over visible bone structure underneath. Like someone had removed all their features but left the skull intact. The clicking got more excited. They were talking about me. One of them held up the deer's skull they'd just finished cleaning and tilted it toward me. Like an offering, or an invitation. I understood then that they weren't hunting for food. This was art, creation. A form of expression I couldn't comprehend. They gestured toward their bone arrangements the way a sculptor might show off their masterpiece. These creatures had been collecting and arranging bones for who knows how long, decades, maybe centuries, perfecting their craft. The patterns had meaning I couldn't understand. Some form of communication or record keeping that used animal skeletons as a medium. and they wanted to add my bones to their collection. The way they looked at me, or would have looked if they'd had eyes, suggested they could see my skeleton through my skin. They were evaluating my bone quality, measuring me as raw material for their next artistic creation. And they found me suitable. They started moving toward me slowly, bone-cleaning tools appearing in their elongated hands. Tools made from antlers and sharpened ribs that looked like they'd never seen rust or wear despite being left exposed in the forest. I ran. Not the steady marathon pace I'd been maintaining. A full sprint, crashing through brush and jumping over fallen logs like my life depended on it. Because it did. They followed, but at a walking pace. Confident they could take me whenever they chose. The clicking sounds got more excited as they discussed how to incorporate my bones into their next arrangement. I could hear them even though they were falling behind. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. My training paid off. I had the endurance to maintain that sprint pace longer than most people could. But I could still hear them behind me, their clicking conversation carrying through the trees. When I finally reached the main trail and found other hikers, I was babbling about bone collectors and art installations. A park ranger came out with me and a few volunteers to check on what I'd found. All the bone arrangements had been moved to different patterns, more complex ones, and scattered around the area where I'd first stopped to take pictures, we found a small spiral of what looked like fingernail clippings. I hadn't cut my nails in weeks, and I definitely hadn't left any clippings out there in the forest. That was 5 years ago. I still run, but never alone, and never in remote areas. I finished that marathon, but I've never gone back to trail running in Virginia. Sometimes I dream about those precise white spirals and the sound of bones clicking together in conversation. And sometimes, when I'm cutting my nails, I count the clippings before I throw them away, just to make sure they're all there. Back when I was 18, I worked at Miller's grocery store in Beckley and had just saved enough to buy my first car, a beat-up Honda Civic with rust spots and a radio that only picked up AM stations. I'd been planning this solo hiking trip for months, ever since my coworker Danny mentioned Bear Creek Trail up in the deep woods near Summersville. Perfect for beginners, he'd said. 9 miles total, well marked. Just don't go too far off the main path. Those mountains have been swallowing people for generations. I should have paid more attention to that last part. October 8th was my day off, and honestly, I needed the space. Senior year had me stressed about college applications. My parents were fighting constantly about money, and I figured some time alone in the mountains might help me think straight. I'd only hiked with my family before short day trips to easier trails, so this felt like a real step toward independence. Packed way too much food because I was nervous, threw in an extra water bottle, and left around 9:30 that morning. The 2-hour drive up into the mountains was beautiful. Fall colors were perfect, deep reds and oranges that seemed to glow in the morning light. The parking area was just a gravel lot carved out of the forest, with space for maybe 8 cars. There were 2 others there when I arrived, a newer Toyota SUV and an old Ford pickup with West Virginia plates. Made me feel better about hiking alone, knowing other people were around. The trail started easy enough. Wide, well-maintained path with those white paint blazes every 50 yards. The forest felt alive, birds calling, squirrels chattering, leaves rustling in the breeze. For the first 4 miles, I passed a few other hikers heading back down. Everyone was friendly, gave that little wave you do on trails. Normal mountain people enjoying a beautiful October day. But somewhere around mile 5, things started feeling different. The sounds faded first. Gradually, like someone was slowly turning down the volume on the forest. Birds stopped singing, no more squirrel chatter. Even the wind seemed to die away, leaving this heavy, expectant silence that made my ears ring. The air got thicker too, harder to breathe, like the atmospheric pressure was changing. And there was a smell, faint at first, metallic and sweet, like old pennies left in the rain. I told myself it was probably just a change in elevation, maybe a weather front moving in. But something deep in my brain, some ancient warning system, was starting to wake up and pay attention. The smell got stronger as I approached what looked like a side trail leading to a clearing. Not marked on my map, just a narrow path disappearing into the trees. I probably should have kept walking, but curiosity got the better of me. The metallic smell was coming from that direction, and I wanted to know what it was. The clearing was maybe 30 yards across, surrounded by tall oaks and maples. At first glance, it looked like an old hunting camp, the kind of place where families might process deer during hunting season. There was a wooden table, some scattered tools, and strips of meat hanging from branches around the perimeter, drying in the cool air. But the meat was wrong. I'm not squeamish about hunting. My dad took deer every season, and I'd helped him dress and butcher plenty of times. This wasn't deer meat. The color was too pale, the texture too smooth, and the pieces were shaped wrong, long and flat in ways that didn't match any animal I knew. I stepped closer, telling myself I was imagining things, that my nerves were just getting the better of me. That's when I noticed the fingernails. One strip of drying meat still had human fingernails attached, pink polish, chipped but still visible. My stomach lurched. I looked at the other pieces with new eyes and saw what I'd been trying not to see. Human flesh, arms, legs, torso sections, all carefully butchered, and hung to cure like venison. Some pieces still had patches of skin attached. Others showed clean cuts through muscle and bone, precise as anything you'd see in a butcher shop. The wooden table was stained dark brown with old blood. Scattered around it were professional tools, bone saws, skinning knives, meat cleavers, all clean and well-maintained. And on the ground, partially hidden under fallen leaves, were driver's licenses. Lots of them. I picked up a few with shaking hands. Photos of missing hikers stared back at me, young people, solo hikers, all with that same hopeful smile you see in vacation pictures. The most recent was dated 5 days ago. Maria Santos, 19, from Charleston. College student, probably up here for the same reasons I was. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in the clearing. He'd been watching me the whole time, standing perfectly still in the tree line, like something that had grown there. When he stepped forward, I understood why I hadn't seen him. His clothes were the same browns and grays as the forest, and he moved with a patience that seemed inhuman. He was enormous, well over 7 feet tall, with hands that looked like they could crush my skull without effort. But it was his face that made my blood freeze. Normal features arranged in a way that was almost right but fundamentally wrong, like a photograph that had been slightly distorted. His teeth, when he smiled, had been filed to points. "You're looking at my winter stores," he said quietly. His voice was calm, conversational, with a thick mountain accent that placed him as local. "Born and raised in these hills. Been preparing for months now. Got to cure the meat properly, you understand. Can't waste good protein." I couldn't move, couldn't speak, just stood there holding Maria Santos's driver's license while he watched me with eyes that held no recognition of my humanity. "Your friend there?" He nodded at the license in my hand. "She lasted 2 days. Put up quite a fight. Most of them don't. Most folks from the outside don't understand these mountains. Don't respect what lives here." He pulled a long knife from his belt, the blade worn smooth from years of use. "See, these trails weren't made for tourists. They're old paths, hunting grounds that have been used for generations. My grandfather taught me, just like his grandfather taught him. City folks come up here thinking they're exploring virgin wilderness, but this land has been claimed for a long time." The knife caught the filtered sunlight as he cleaned dirt from under his fingernails with the tip. "Trail gets real easy to follow when you know where it's supposed to lead. All those nice white blazes? They don't mark the path out of these mountains. They mark the path deeper in. To places like this, to me." My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. There's something about true predators that triggers a freeze response in prey animals. Some deep recognition that movement means death. "You're probably wondering how long this has been going on," he continued, seemingly in no hurry. "How many folks like you have found their way to my table? Truth is, I stopped counting after 50. Could be twice that by now. These mountains are patient, you see. They provide when they're ready." He gestured with the knife at the licenses scattered on the ground. Every one of them came here looking for something. Adventure, maybe. Peace and quiet. Escape from whatever was troubling them down in the world. What they found was purpose. My purpose. Something in his tone made me look up, and I saw he was watching me with genuine curiosity, like I was an interesting specimen. "You're different, though," he said. "Most folks panic by now. Start running or screaming or begging. But you're listening, learning. That's unusual. Makes me think maybe these mountains brought you here for a different reason." The freeze response broke like a dam bursting. I dropped the license and ran. Behind me, I heard him laugh, not crazy or maniacal, just pleased, like I'd finally done something entertaining. He didn't chase me immediately. I could hear him moving around the clearing, the clink of tools being gathered, the scrape of metal on wood, taking his time. No urgency at all. I crashed through the forest, ignoring the trails completely, pushing through underbrush that tore at my clothes and skin. The silence followed me, no bird calls, no insect buzz, just the sound of my own crashing through the brush and my heart hammering against my ribs. Every direction I tried seemed to lead me in circles. Paths that should have led downhill curved back on themselves. Landmarks I thought I recognized appeared where they shouldn't be. The forest itself seemed to be helping him, channeling me like water through a funnel. I stepped in something that shouldn't have been there, a wire snare hidden under fallen leaves, positioned exactly where a panicked person would put their foot. It cut deep into my ankle, and I went down hard. The wire was anchored to a tree with the kind of knot my grandfather had taught me for securing boats. This wasn't some random trap, it was professional work. He found me 5 minutes later, still trying to untangle the wire from my bleeding ankle. Stood there watching while I struggled, that same curious expression on his face. "Interesting," he said. "Most folks would have tried to cut the wire. You're trying to untie it. Shows respect for the craftsmanship. I appreciate that." I finally got free and tried to run again, but the blood loss was making me lightheaded. He followed at a walking pace, occasionally calling out directions like a helpful guide. "Trail to your left leads to a drop-off," he'd say conversationally. "Might want to bear right unless you're planning to fly." The pursuit went on for what felt like hours. Every time I thought I'd lost him, he'd appear, ahead of me, leaning against a tree like he'd been waiting. Never hurried, never breathing hard, just patient and inevitable as winter. It was getting dark when I finally stumbled onto something that looked like salvation, a steep cliff face with a narrow ledge running along it. Without thinking, I started climbing down, using tree roots and rock outcroppings as handholds. Desperate move, but it was that or let him catch me. Halfway down, I heard him call from above. That's clever thinking. Shows good survival instincts. But you can't climb down forever, and I know every cave and hiding spot in these mountains. Been using them longer than you've been alive. His voice was getting fainter as I climbed, but it carried clearly in the still air. "I'll be waiting when you come back up, or when you fall. Either way, the meat will be properly tenderized." I reached the bottom as full darkness settled over the mountains, found myself in a narrow gorge with a stream running through it. The water was ice cold and moved fast enough to cover the sound of my movement. I followed it downstream, hoping it would lead me out of his territory. The stream led to a dirt road, barely wide enough for one vehicle. I'd never been so happy to see tire tracks in my life. Followed the road for maybe a mile before I saw headlights coming toward me. Park ranger truck, moving slow like they were looking for something. I flagged them down, probably looking like I'd been mauled by a bear, covered in blood and scratches, clothes torn, barely coherent. The ranger's name was Bill Hutchins, and he'd been working these mountains for 20 years. When I told him what I'd found, his face went gray. "Jesus Christ," he said. "We've been wondering about the missing hikers. Figured they got lost, maybe fell off a cliff. Never thought." He radioed for backup immediately. They found the clearing that night, following my directions and the blood trail from my ankle. 15 sets of remains in various stages of processing, tools that looked like they'd been maintained for decades, and journals, detailed records going back 40 years, describing hunting techniques, seasonal migration patterns of hikers, weather conditions that made people easier to track. They never found Eugene Carpenter. That was the name in the journals, along with meticulous records of every person who'd ended up in that clearing. When the search teams went back the next morning, the camp was empty. Tools gone, meat cache cleared out, even the blood stains scrubbed clean, like it had never existed. The official report listed him as a suspect in 23 disappearances over 8 years. But those journals suggested the operation was much older than that. Some entries were written in different handwriting, different ink, like it was a family business passed down through generations, just like he'd said. They closed the trail permanently and put up a memorial at the parking area. I testified at a hearing about the case, had to describe the camp and identify photos of the victims. The families needed closure, needed to know what had happened to their children. But Carpenter was never caught. Some folks think he moved deeper into the mountains, found new hunting grounds. Others believe he never left, that he's still out there, patient as the mountains themselves, waiting for the next solo hiker to find their way to his table. I still go hiking, but never alone, and never in West Virginia. Those mountains left marks on me that go deeper than the scars on my ankle. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night convinced I can smell that metallic sweetness, or hear his voice calling directions through the trees. The thing that haunts me most isn't the camp or the bodies or even his filed teeth. It's the patience, the absolute certainty that he had all the time in the world, that the mountains themselves were helping him, channeling lost souls to his table like tributaries feeding a river. To this day, I can't eat jerky or see pink nail polish without my hands starting to shake. And whenever I smell that particular combination of metal and sweetness, like old pennies in the rain, I remember that some places in these mountains are older than civilization, with their own rules and their own purposes. The official investigation is still open, though nobody talks about it much anymore. They say Eugene Carpenter died in those mountains, that exposure or wildlife got him eventually. But I know better. Some things don't die, they just wait, patient and inevitable as the changing seasons, for the next person who thinks they're exploring empty wilderness. The mountains remember, and they're always hungry. I'm 29 years old, and I work night shifts at Regional Medical Center here in southwestern Virginia. 3 months ago, my mother died from pancreatic cancer. And honestly, I haven't been handling it well. The hospital social worker kept pushing me toward grief counseling, but sitting in some sterile office talking about my feelings felt impossible. What I really needed was space to think, somewhere I could process everything without people watching me fall apart. That's how I ended up researching hiking trails online. I'd never been much for the outdoors, but something about being alone in the mountains felt right. I found this trail called Healing Ridge, HT, about an hour drive into the deep Appalachian wilderness, far from any towns or cell towers. The hiking forums said it was perfect for beginners, with several overlooks where you could sit and reflect. October 14th marked exactly 3 months since Mom died, so I decided to make it a memorial hike. Pack some of her favorite vanilla wafers, maybe have a little ceremony at the highest point. The morning felt crisp and peaceful as I parked at the empty trailhead. Just a small gravel clearing beside an old Forest Service road that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in years. No other cars. No sounds except wind in the trees. For the first time since the funeral, I felt like I was doing something Mom would approve of. She always said I spent too much time cooped up inside. The first few miles were exactly what I'd hoped for. Well-marked trail, gentle incline, beautiful hardwood forest just starting to show fall colors. I found myself thinking about Mom in a way that felt healing instead of devastating, like she was walking beside me, encouraging me to keep going. The silence felt therapeutic, meditative. I was starting to think my social worker had been right about this outdoor therapy thing. Around mile 4, I noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely quiet. No bird songs, no insects, not even wind rustling the leaves. The temperature had dropped maybe 10 degrees in the span of a few minutes, and the air felt thicker, harder to breathe. I stopped walking and listened, but there was absolutely nothing, just this heavy, oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. That's when I saw the woman sitting on a fallen log beside the trail. She looked to be in her 50s, with graying hair and expensive hiking gear. When she saw me, she stood and smiled, but something about her expression felt wrong. Too wide, too eager. Like she'd been waiting specifically for me. "Beautiful morning for a hike," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the unnatural quiet. "Heading up to the overlook?" "Yeah, that's the plan." I tried to sound normal, but my instincts were screaming that something was off. How had I not heard her approach? How long had she been sitting there? "I'm Patricia," she said, extending her hand. "I come up here quite often. It's perfect for people who need to process difficult emotions away from the world." When I shook her hand, her skin felt wrong. Too cold, too dry, like old paper. But her grip was strong, stronger than it should have been for someone her age. She held on just a fraction too long. "I just lost my mother," I found myself saying, though I hadn't planned to share that with a stranger. Patricia's eyes lit up with what looked like genuine interest, but there was something hungry in her expression. Cancer? I nodded, surprised by her accuracy. How did you experience? She said simply. I've met a lot of people like you on these trails. The newly bereaved are drawn to places like this, isolated places where they can grieve without judgment. She gestured up the trail. Would you mind if I walked with you? The overlook can be emotionally overwhelming for people in your situation. I'd hate for you to have a difficult experience alone. Every instinct told me to decline, but my grief-addled brain latched onto the offer of companionship. I'd been so isolated since Mom died, and Patricia seemed to understand my pain in a way that felt genuine. As we walked, she asked careful questions about my relationship with Mom, how the illness had progressed, what the final days were like. Her questions were specific, clinical, like she was gathering data rather than showing sympathy. But I was so desperate to talk to someone who seemed to understand that I answered everything. Tell me about the night she died, Patricia said, as we climbed higher into the mountains. What was the hospital room like? What equipment was she connected to? I described everything: the heart monitor, the IV drip, the way the nurse's station was positioned down the hall. Patricia nodded along, occasionally adding details I hadn't mentioned, details she shouldn't have known. The overnight nurse was particularly attentive, she said casually. Always checking on your mother, taking detailed notes about her condition. My blood went cold. How could you possibly know that? Patricia stopped walking and turned to face me. In the strange, muted light filtering through the canopy, her features looked different, sharper. Her smile was still there, but it didn't reach her eyes anymore. Because I was that nurse, she said quietly. I was there when your mother died. The forest around us seemed to press closer, the silence becoming absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of civilization, just Patricia's voice in the unnatural quiet. I've been following your grief journey for months, she continued, pulling out a small digital recorder. Your social media posts, your support group comments, your online searches for hiking trails. You've been such an interesting case study. I tried to step backward, but my legs felt weak, unsteady. What are you talking about? I specialize in grief research, Patricia said, her voice taking on a clinical tone. I study how families process loss, particularly when that loss is accelerated by external factors. She showed me the recorder, its red light blinking steadily. Your mother didn't have to suffer as long as she did. Her condition was manageable with proper pain medication and care. But I was curious to see how prolonged suffering would affect family dynamics, how it would shape your grief patterns. The world tilted around me. You're lying. I have recordings, she said, pulling out a phone. Would you like to hear your mother calling for you while I documented her pain responses? I have charts tracking her decline, graphs showing how each night of inadequate care contributed to her psychological deterioration. She tapped the screen, and I heard Mom's voice, weak and scared, calling my name, begging for someone to help her. In the background, I could hear Patricia's voice taking clinical notes about pain tolerance and family stress indicators. Stop, I whispered, but she kept playing the recordings. This is the climax of my research, Patricia said, holding up her recorder to capture my reaction. Watching families confront the truth about how their loved ones really died. Your response is providing excellent data for my publications. I fumbled for my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. We were too deep in the mountains, too far from civilization. Patricia noticed my attempts and laughed. No one can hear you up here, she said. That's why I chose this location. I've brought 7 other families to this exact spot over the past 2 years. Each one provided valuable insights into grief, manipulation, and psychological trauma. She stepped closer, and I could smell something wrong about her, like antiseptic mixed with decay. The beautiful thing about grief is how it isolates people, how it makes them willing to follow strangers into remote locations, desperate for any connection or understanding. I tried to run, but the trail behind us looked different now. Unfamiliar. The trees had shifted, the path had changed direction. We were somewhere that shouldn't exist, somewhere that felt outside the normal rules of geography. Where are we? I managed to ask. Exactly where we need to be, Patricia said. A place where I can complete my research without interruption, where families can confront the truth about what really happened to their loved ones. She showed me more recordings, other patients, other families, a pattern of deliberately induced suffering that stretched back years. All of it documented with the same clinical detachment, the same hunger for human pain. "Your mother was particularly vocal during her final hours," Patricia said, scrolling through audio files. "She kept asking why no one was helping her, why the nurses weren't responding to her call button. She died thinking she'd been abandoned by everyone, including you." Something snapped inside me. Not just grief or rage, but something deeper. Something that felt connected to the strange, wrong energy of this place. The unnatural silence, the shifting geography, the way Patricia seemed less human with each passing moment. I lunged forward and grabbed her recorder, smashing it against a tree. Patricia screamed, not in pain, but in fury, like I'd destroyed something precious and irreplaceable. "You can't stop the research," she hissed, her voice changing, becoming something that didn't quite sound human anymore. "The data must be collected. The patterns must be documented." That's when I realized what I was really looking at. Not just a killer wearing the mask of a medical professional, but something that fed on grief itself. Something that had found the perfect hunting ground in isolated mountain trails where the newly bereaved came seeking solace. I ran. The trail twisted and changed around me as I fled, sometimes leading uphill, sometimes down, defying any logical geography. Behind me, I could hear Patricia following, but her footsteps sounded wrong. Too heavy, too rhythmic, like something mimicking human movement without understanding how it should sound. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and suddenly I was back at the parking lot. My car sat exactly where I'd left it, but now there were other vehicles. Old rusted cars and trucks that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. On each windshield was a missing person flyer. Faces of hikers who disappeared in these mountains over the years. I drove home and called the police, but when they investigated, they found no trail called Healing Ridge, no record of any Forest Service road matching my description. The GPS coordinates I'd written down led to an impenetrable section of old-growth forest that hadn't been disturbed in centuries. They did find something, though. Hospital records showing a pattern of suspicious deaths during night shifts over the past 5 years. Patients who died in more pain than their conditions warranted, families whose grief seemed unusually severe and prolonged. All connected to a nurse named Patricia Williams, who had worked at Regional Medical until she disappeared 3 months ago. 3 months ago. Right around the time Mom died. I still work night shifts at the hospital, but I can't shake the feeling that Patricia's research isn't finished. Sometimes I catch glimpses of her in the hallways, always just at the edge of my vision. Always watching, always taking notes. Other staff members have started commenting on how many families seem unusually devastated by losses that should have been manageable. How many relatives mention meeting a helpful grief counselor on hiking trails. Last week, I found a digital recorder in my locker. When I played it back, I heard my own voice describing Mom's final night, providing the exact kind of detailed emotional data that Patricia had been collecting. I don't remember making that recording. I don't hike anymore. I avoid the mountains entirely. But sometimes, late at night when I'm walking through the hospital corridors, I hear that familiar clinical voice asking families about their grief, offering them therapeutic hiking recommendations for isolated trails where they can process their loss in peace, where they can become part of the research. The grief counselor is still out there, still collecting her data. And I'm starting to think that what I encountered in those mountains wasn't just a killer, but something much older and hungrier that has found the perfect cover in our modern world of medical professionals and therapeutic interventions. Something that feeds on the specific kind of pain that comes from losing someone you love. And it's still working at my hospital. Back when I was 24, I worked the graveyard shift stocking shelves at the Walmart outside Prestonsburg, Kentucky. My whole life had just imploded 3 weeks earlier when my fiancée Jessica left me for her physical therapy instructor. Not just left, moved in with him the same week she called off our wedding. I'd been going through the motions at our little Baptist church, but sitting in those pews surrounded by happy couples, I felt like God had either forgotten about me or was actively punishing me for something I couldn't figure out. Pastor Mike noticed I was struggling. After a particularly rough Wednesday night service where I'd basically sat there fighting back tears, he he suggested I take some time for what he called wilderness prayer. He told me about this old trail system deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest called Pilgrim's Walk, a network of paths that circuit preachers had used in the 1800s to travel between mountain communities for revival meetings. Said sometimes a man needs to get away from civilization entirely to hear God's voice clearly. The idea appealed to me. My grandfather had always said the mountains had a way of putting things in perspective, and I figured 3 days of hiking, fasting, and prayer might help me figure out where my life was supposed to go from here. Plus, October in eastern Kentucky is beautiful. The leaves would be at peak color, and the weather would be perfect for camping. I took October 20th through 22nd off work. The trailhead started near the ruins of an old mission church, where they used to hold massive outdoor revivals. Pastor Mike had given me a hand-drawn map his grandfather had made, showing the original preacher paths that connected 7 different mountain communities. Most hikers stuck to the main trail, but Mike suggested I follow the old circuit route to really experience what those early ministers had felt carrying the gospel through the wilderness. I packed minimally on purpose. This was meant to be a spiritual fast, not a recreational camping trip. Just my tent, sleeping bag, water filter, my Bible, a journal, and enough food for maybe one meal. I wanted to experience the same kind of dependence on God that those circuit preachers had felt. The first day of hiking felt incredible. The autumn colors were spectacular, and there's something about being deep in the mountains that makes you feel closer to whatever created all that beauty. I followed the old preacher path, which was barely visible in places, 1919-2, just worn spots in the rock and occasional stone cairns marking the way. By evening, I'd reached what my map labeled as Baptism Hollow, a clearing beside a clear mountain stream where the preachers used to hold outdoor baptisms. I set up camp as the sun was setting, and during my evening prayers, something extraordinary happened. I felt this overwhelming spiritual presence, unlike anything I'd ever experienced in church. It wasn't just emotion, it was like being physically filled with divine energy. For the first time in my life, I began speaking in tongues, words flowing out of me in a language I didn't understand but somehow felt completely natural. The experience was so intense I prayed through the entire night without feeling tired. I received what felt like direct messages from God about my purpose, about how Jessica leaving was preparation for a greater calling. Everything was incredibly specific and personal. Time sen, details about my childhood, my struggles with faith, even things I'd never told anyone. By dawn, I had complete peace about my future for the first time since the breakup. I decided to extend my fast for the full 3 days to maintain this spiritual connection. The second day, the messages became even more detailed. I felt chosen for a special ministry that would help other young people find authentic faith. The spiritual presence was constant now, guiding my prayers as I hiked deeper into the mountains following the old circuit route. But something started feeling off that second evening. The spiritual voice began making demands that didn't sit right with me. It commanded me to carve crosses into my arms with my knife to demonstrate dedication to Christ's suffering. When I hesitated, the presence became angry, insisting I prove my faith was genuine. It demanded I burn my church membership card because organized religion was corrupting pure spiritual truth. The commands escalated throughout the night. Remove all my clothes because earthly possessions blocked divine communication. Build an altar using animal bones scattered around the campsite. When I refused to kill small animals as sacrifices, the voice screamed that I was weak, like all Christians who claimed faith but wouldn't truly obey God. On the third night, during what I thought was prayer, the voice commanded me to cut my throat to join God immediately in paradise. I actually raised my knife toward my neck before some deeper instinct made me stop. That's when I heard laughter, not divine joy, but something cold and mocking that made my blood freeze. Finally, the voice said, dropping all pretense of holiness, "Most of you God-hungry fools make it so much easier." The thing explained with casual cruelty that it had been mimicking divine communication perfectly. It specifically targeted Christians because our spiritual hunger made us incredibly easy to deceive. For over a century, it had been using these old revival sites to possess seekers who came looking for authentic spiritual experiences. Those famous revivals your precious church talks about? It laughed. Half the people who got filled with the Spirit were actually filled with something else entirely. We've been feeding on corrupted faith in these mountains since before your great-great-grandfather was born. The entity began forcing me to blaspheme against everything I believed, making me say horrible things while I fought to regain control of my own voice. It invaded my thoughts completely, controlling my hands as I watched myself destroy my Bible, rip up family photos, tear apart everything meaningful to me while screaming protests that came out as laughter. But here's what it didn't expect. My grandfather had told me stories about things in these mountains that weren't godly. Old Cherokee warnings about spirits that pretended to be ancestors. Early settler accounts of entities that mimicked human voices to lure people into the deep woods. I remembered his words. When something supernatural claims to speak for God, you test it against everything you know God actually said. I started reciting scripture, not the emotional verses about love and comfort, but the hard ones about testing spirits, about Satan disguising himself as an angel of light. The entity retaliated by making me hurt myself, forcing my hands to cut my arms with the knife, slam my head against trees. But each verse I spoke seemed to weaken its control slightly. For what felt like hours, I fought this thing through sheer stubborn faith, declaring scripture while it caused excruciating spiritual and physical pain. The demon's grip finally started breaking when I focused on one specific verse. Greater is he who is in me than he who is in the world. I didn't cast anything out dramatically. I just held on to that truth with everything I had until the presence suddenly released me like a snapped rubber band. I packed my destroyed campsite in complete darkness and hiked out using my phone's flashlight, still feeling like something was following me but no longer controlling me. I drove straight to Pastor Mike's house at 3 a.m. and told him everything. He listened without skepticism, then connected me with an older minister who specialized in what he called spiritual warfare counseling. Turns out, I wasn't the first person to have this kind of experience on those old revival trails. The real horror isn't the demon, though. It's how perfectly it understood what I needed to hear. Every detail about God's plan for my life, about Jessica leaving being preparation for ministry, it was all exactly what my broken heart wanted to believe. Even now, 5 years later, I can't always tell which thoughts during those 3 days were genuine spiritual insights and which were demonic manipulation designed to make me more receptive to its ultimate goal. I still go to church. I still pray. But I never go into the mountains alone anymore, and I'm deeply suspicious of any spiritual experience that feels too good to be true. The scars on my arms have faded to thin white lines, but they remind me daily that spiritual hunger can make you vulnerable to things that know exactly how to exploit your deepest needs. Sometimes I wonder about other people who've taken solo spiritual retreats in those mountains. How many came back changed in ways they didn't fully understand? How many are still out there, thinking they're doing God's work while something else pulls their strings? I counsel young people at our church now, and when they talk about seeking dramatic spiritual experiences, I always tell them the same thing my grandfather told me. The most dangerous lies are the ones that contain just enough truth to make you stop questioning what you're hearing. The thing that keeps me awake some nights isn't the memory of demonic possession. It's knowing that for 2.5 days, I was completely convinced I was having the most authentic spiritual experience of my life. And if that old Cherokee warning hadn't echoed in my memory at exactly the right moment, I might still be convinced. That's true horror, not knowing whether the voice in your head is divine inspiration or something else entirely, wearing a perfect disguise. I was 20 when this happened, working construction during the day and studying for my electrician's license at night. Back then, I thought I had the mountains figured out. My dad had been taking me hiking and camping in Virginia's Blue Ridge since I was maybe 7 or 8, and by 20, I figured I knew those trails better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. I was cocky about it, honestly. I'd done overnight trips, multi-day backpacking, winter camping, the whole deal. So when I planned a 4-day solo trip for October 16th through 19th during my vacation week, I didn't think twice about packing light. The weather forecast was absolutely perfect. Clear skies, highs in the 60 seconds, lows in the 40 seconds, zero chance of precipitation. I'd done this exact same trail twice before in similar weather, so I brought my lightweight summer sleeping bag, a couple changes of clothes, and minimal gear. My girlfriend Sarah dropped me off at the trailhead that Tuesday morning, planning to pick me up Thursday afternoon. I remember kissing her goodbye and feeling this rush of excitement about 4 days of complete solitude in my favorite mountains. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. Crystal clear skies, comfortable temperatures, and the fall colors were absolutely incredible. Those deep reds and bright yellows that make the Blue Ridge famous. I made good time on the trail, stopped for lunch by a creek I'd fished as a kid, and reached my planned campsite by late afternoon. Everything was textbook perfect. I set up my tent on a flat spot I'd used before, filtered some water, made dinner on my camp stove, and just enjoyed being out there. The sunset was gorgeous, and I fell asleep under more stars than you can see anywhere near civilization. Already planning to cover some serious miles the next day. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of my tent collapsing. At first, I thought maybe a branch had fallen or something, but when I unzipped the door, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was snow. Not just a light dusting, we're talking about 8 inches of heavy, wet snow, and it was still coming down hard. The temperature had dropped to what felt like 10 below zero, which was physically impossible for October in Virginia. I'm not exaggerating when I say impossible. I'd been camping in these mountains for over a decade, and I'd never seen anything remotely like this. Within 2 hours, the snow was over a foot deep and the temperature kept dropping. I was already starting to shiver uncontrollably, and I couldn't feel my fingers or toes. My lightweight sleeping bag and summer clothes were completely useless against these Arctic conditions. My phone was dead, not just low battery, but completely non-functional from the extreme cold. Same with my GPS unit. The thing just wouldn't turn on. I tried to hike out immediately, but visibility was basically zero. The howling wind was driving the snow sideways, and the trail I'd hiked hundreds of times was completely buried. I couldn't see more than maybe 5 feet in any direction. Within 4 hours of waking up, I was in the early stages of hypothermia and losing coordination in my hands. I had no choice but to dig an emergency snow cave using my bare hands, which were already starting to show signs of frostbite. The temperature continued dropping throughout that day. I'm talking about what felt like 30 below zero, temperatures that would kill an exposed human in minutes. This wasn't just unusual weather for October in Virginia. This was meteorologically impossible. My emergency shelter was barely keeping me alive, and I was losing body heat faster than I could generate it. I couldn't start a fire because everything was soaked from the snow, and my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't operate my lighter or anything else. My food was frozen solid. My water bottles had turned to ice. I was having hypothermic hallucinations, ISAPUS, seeing rescue teams that weren't there, hearing daughter, helicopters that didn't exist. By the second day, I was entering the final stages of hypothermia and starting to lose consciousness for periods of time. I knew I was going to die if I didn't do something extreme. That's when survival mode kicked in completely. I managed to kill a deer with my hunting knife. Don't ask me how, because I still don't remember the details clearly. I used its fresh blood to warm my core temperature and gutted it to climb inside the body cavity. I know how that sounds, but it saved my life. The deer's body heat was the only thing keeping me from freezing to death. I used the deer hide as insulation and ate raw meat to get calories and internal warmth. I burned everything flammable I had. My backpack, extra clothes, anything that would produce even a few minutes of heat. The whole time, the temperature felt like it was still dropping, reaching levels that should have been impossible for any human to survive. On the third day, something changed. I started to realize that the cold was following me specifically. When I tried to move to a different location, the freezing temperature moved with me like some kind of focused phenomenon. Areas I left behind returned to normal. October temperatures, weather, I could actually see the line where the supernatural cold ended and normal weather began. But wherever I went, the area around me became instantly Arctic. I found dead animals frozen solid in a perfect circle around my location. Birds, squirrels, even insects, all frozen as if something was projecting this killing cold specifically at me. The cold seemed intelligent somehow, getting worse when I tried to escape or find warmth, like it was responding to my actions. That's when I understood this wasn't natural weather. Something was using cold as a weapon against me personally. The cold responded to my emotional state, was unknown. It got worse when I felt hopeful, and lessened slightly when I despaired. I realized that whatever was doing this fed on my suffering and wanted to watch me slowly freeze to death. So I stopped trying to stay warm and started moving constantly. For 18 straight hours, I hiked through that supernatural cold, even as I approached the final stages of hypothermia. Every time I almost collapsed, I forced myself to keep moving out of pure spite against whatever was trying to kill me. I wasn't going to give it the satisfaction of watching me die. The entity seemed frustrated that I wouldn't just lie down and freeze. The cold began fluctuating wildly, sometimes dropping to impossible lows, other times warming just enough to give me false hope before dropping again. It was like something was throwing a tantrum because I wouldn't cooperate with my own death. After 20 hours of continuous movement through that impossible cold, I suddenly broke through into normal October weather. It was like walking through an invisible wall. One step I was in the Arctic, the next step I was in normal 50-degree mountain air. I collapsed on a main trail where other hikers found me and called for emergency medical help. I spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for severe hypothermia and frostbite. I lost parts of 2 toes and still don't have full feeling in my fingertips. But here's the thing that still bothers me. When the doctors called the National Weather Service to report what had happened, meteorologists confirmed that no storm had occurred in that area during those 3 days. According to official records, the weather had been clear and mild the entire time. I never hike alone anymore, and I always carry full cold weather gear, regardless of the forecast. Because whatever was out there that tried to kill me with impossible cold, I don't think it was done with me. Sometimes, even now, on perfectly warm days, I'll suddenly feel that same killing cold start to creep in around the edges. That's when I know it's time to get indoors and stay around other people. To this day, I still don't understand what happened to me out there. But I know it wasn't natural weather, and I know something intelligent was behind it. Something that wanted to freeze me to death slowly, and something that might still be waiting for another chance. I'm 29 now, but I was 27 when this happened, working the morning shift at a Starbucks in Charleston and doing freelance podcast editing on the side to chip away at my student loans. I'd always been into audio production, carried around this little portable recording setup everywhere, because you never know when you'll catch something interesting. A weird bird call, street musicians, even just the way rain sounds different on various surfaces. I was building up this library of sounds, hoping to eventually break into documentary work or maybe score some nature films. October of 2022, I decided to take a long weekend and head up into the mountains of West Virginia to record autumn sounds. You know, migrating birds, wind through the colored leaves, that kind of thing. I'd been researching locations online and found this remote 18-mile trail system that supposedly had incredible acoustic properties because of how the mountains formed these natural amphitheaters. The timing was perfect too. October 26th was right in the peak of fall activity. I packed my good recording equipment along with camping gear, planning to spend 3 days up there gathering material. The trail started in this valley that was supposed to be famous among sound engineers for its natural amplification. I was excited, honestly. This felt like the kind of project that could really advance my career, you know? High-quality nature recordings that I could license out or use in my own projects. The first day went exactly as planned. I hiked about 6 miles in, found this perfect clearing surrounded by maples and oaks, and set up my tent. The acoustics were incredible. I could hear birds calling from what had to be miles away, crystal clear. I spent hours recording water sounds from a nearby creek, atmospheric wind noise, even the subtle rustling of leaves falling. By evening, I knew I had some really good material. I set up camp in this valley clearing that had the most amazing, natural sound amplification I'd ever experienced. You could whisper on one side and hear it clearly from 50 feet away. I remember thinking this was exactly the kind of unique location that would set my work apart from all the generic nature recordings out there. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to my recording equipment picking up something weird. At first, I thought it was maybe a distant radio station bleeding through. But it wasn't music or voices. It was these rhythmic pulses, almost like Morse code but not quite. The pattern felt almost like language, but I couldn't recognize it as anything I'd heard before. I adjusted my equipment to isolate and amplify whatever was coming through. The signal seemed to be originating somewhere close by, maybe within 100 yards of my campsite. I figured it might be some kind of illegal radio setup or maybe emergency equipment that had been abandoned up here. The mountains are full of old mining equipment and forgotten infrastructure. I recorded several hours of this signal, and the weird thing was, it kept getting stronger throughout the night. Like whatever was broadcasting was moving closer to me. By the time the sun started coming up, I could tell this wasn't electronic at all. There were these organic variations in the pulses, breathing patterns, subtle biological rhythms that no machine would have. I used my directional microphone to track where the signal was coming from, and it led me deeper into the forest, away from any marked trails. My equipment was showing signal strength that meant I should be right on top of whatever was broadcasting, but I couldn't see anything that could be making these sounds. After following it for about 4 hours, going way deeper into the wilderness than any trail markers indicated, I found this clearing where the transmission was loudest. But there was nothing there. Nothing visible anyway, just trees and undergrowth and normal forest stuff. My recording equipment was going crazy though, showing signal strength like the source was standing right next to me. That's when I realized the signal was responding to my presence. When I moved, the pattern changed. When I made noise, it adjusted. Whatever was transmitting knew I was there and was trying to communicate with me. The broadcast started including perfect mimics of my footsteps, my breathing, even my voice patterns. I spoke into my microphone, just said, "Hello," and the signal immediately played back a distorted version of my words. Not an echo, but like something was learning my language in real time. Then, I heard my name being transmitted back to me, though I'd never spoken it aloud in the forest. I tried basic communication, counting, clapping, simple words, and the signal responded to everything perfectly. The responses became increasingly complex, eventually forming what sounded like fluent human speech. But then it started broadcasting personal information about me. My address, my phone number, my social security number. Information that couldn't possibly be available out here in the middle of nowhere. The signal started including voices of people I knew. My mom calling my name, my coworker Sarah having a conversation with someone about weekend plans. My ex-girlfriend laughing at something I'd said 2 years ago. It was somehow accessing information directly from my mind, including memories I hadn't consciously thought about in years. The transmission began narrating my private thoughts and experiences that I'd never shared with anyone. Embarrassing moments from childhood. Things I'd done that I was ashamed of. Fears I'd never spoken aloud. I understood this wasn't just communication, this was active data extraction from my consciousness. I tried to leave, but the signal followed me, got stronger instead of weaker as I moved away from the clearing. The entity, because by now I knew it was some kind of entity, was learning my entire life history, my personality, my memories, in real time. It was downloading me. The transmission began broadcasting my deepest secrets and childhood memories in my own voice. Things I'd forgotten I even remembered. It started making predictions about my future. Career plans, relationship decisions I hadn't made yet, events that were going to happen to me. And I somehow knew it had done this to many others before me. It had accumulated vast knowledge about human consciousness by doing exactly this to people like me. The signal was overloading my brain with information, making it impossible to think clearly. I understood that it wasn't just collecting my data, it was uploading something back into my mind, rewriting my brain with alien information. I smashed all my recording equipment against a tree and ran toward the main trail, but the transmission continued inside my head. No equipment needed anymore. It was part of me now. That was 2 years ago. Every prediction it made has come true exactly as transmitted. My mom got diagnosed with the cancer it warned me about. Sarah quit her job the exact day it said she would. I got the promotion to the documentary company 3 months later, just like it told me I would. I can still hear the signal in quiet moments. And lately, I've started making my own predictions about other people that always turn out correct. Last week, I told my neighbor his wife was going to leave him on Thursday. She did. I knew my sister was pregnant before she did. I'm terrified of what's happening to me. I think that thing is still downloading, still processing, still changing me into something else. I don't go into the mountains anymore. I don't even like being alone in quiet places. Because sometimes, in the silence, I can hear it calling other people's names.